Hey, I am excited about this message series, and I want to encourage you to stick with me for the next couple of weeks because I'll maintain that for many of you, God is going to stir something up, and your life and your world will never be the same. So let's go ahead and begin like this. If you were Miss Popularity, you were extremely good looking, the head cheerleader, if you were the best of the best, the star athlete, if you have ever been voted most likely to succeed, well, my friends, God can still use you. You see, I maintain no matter what stage of life you are in, that God uses ordinary people to be a part of His extraordinary plans. That God uses ordinary people to accomplish His purposes, to accomplish His goal. And that is the driving story behind the book of Nehemiah. Yep, that's it. We're going to delve into the book of Nehemiah, right there in the middle of the Old Testament. Now, just to kind of give you a little bit of background. Nehemiah, he was not a priest, he was not a prophet, he was not a king, he was not a warrior. Nehemiah was a cupbearer. In other words, he was a wine taster for the king. Now, I know for those of you out there who like wine, you're thinking, that's the job for me, right? Yeah, well, it sounds like a pretty good job, but there are some dangers. You see, Nehemiah, he would have been well trained in court etiquette. He was probably a pretty good looking guy. He would have been a congenial companion for the king, always having an ear to listen. He would have been well trusted, and he would have chosen the wine for the king. And he would always taste the wine before he presented it to the king, just in case someone wanted to poison the king. So in a way, Nehemiah, he was a glorified butler, but he would have been extremely well trusted. You see, Nehemiah served the Persian king Artaxerxes. And it just so happens that King Artaxerxes, his dad, King Xerxes, was actually murdered in his own bedchamber in his palace. And so the king would only surround himself with people that he trusted. Well, Nehemiah, just an ordinary Joe Schmo, a cupbearer who was serving the king, was extremely bothered by something he heard. It was in Nehemiah chapter 1, beginning at the first verse. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa. And I already know that many of you are out there going, what in the world is he talking about? In the month of Kislev, I know the last time you looked at your calendar, there is no month of Kislev, is there? Well, the month of Kislev corresponds to our November, December. Yeah, it's that season of the year where we'd be prepping our houses, decorating our houses for the holidays. But they would have been doing no such thing. You see, the year was 444 BC, over 400 years before Jesus was born. And Nehemiah was serving the king in the citadel of Susa. Now, once again, what is a citadel of Susa? Well, a citadel would have been one of the capital cities. It would have been extremely well fortified. And Susa is in modern day Iran. It sits about 160 miles north of the Persian Gulf. And this is where King Artaxerxes would have lived probably for several months each and every year. Nehemiah chapter 1 goes on to say, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men. And I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that has survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile are back in the province, and who are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. So let's go ahead and unpack the context here, because it's important for us to understand exactly what's taking place. You see, for 140 years, the walls, the protective walls of Jerusalem had been destroyed. They're laying in rubble. The gate, the city gate, was burned. This was extremely embarrassing to the residents of Jerusalem. They would have been vulnerable to attack from neighboring nations. You see, it goes all the way back to the Old Testament, when God said, you shall have no other gods before me. God told his chosen people, the people of Israel, if you obey my commands, if you follow me, I will bless you. But if you turn from me, well, there's consequences. You know, it kind of dawns on me. Have you ever noticed all throughout the scripture, the people of Israel, they always turned their hearts from God time and time again, but they never completely and totally walked away from God. It was always God plus something, right? Much like us today. I mean, think about this. You know, we say that we're followers, right? We say that we believe in God, and yet we always seem to add something to it. Well, you see, that's what happened to them. God was always there, but then they began to worship false gods. Their hearts began to drift from God. They were making other things priorities. And then all of a sudden, God allowed King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, to come in and defeat Judah, defeat the people of Israel. The year was 586 BC. The King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army destroyed Jerusalem, tearing down its walls. They burned down the temple, which was the epicenter of the Israelite worship. They took many of the inhabitants into captivity, and they spread them all around the region, all around the area. They were serving as slaves. And then in 539 BC, Cyrus the Great, a Persian king, came in and defeated the Babylonians. Right now, King Cyrus the Great, he was extremely well known for preserving the culture of the peoples that he defeated. And so he wouldn't just do away with their culture, he'd preserve it and even help the people elevate it. And so when Cyrus the Great came in, he allowed some of the Israelites who were taken into captivity, into exile, to return back to Jerusalem, to begin to rebuild the temple, to begin to rebuild the city walls. Well, it was slow going. They were having an extremely difficult time to do it. Many historians think that neighboring nations would come in and constantly defeat them and tear the walls back down. Well, several kings later, several generations later, King Artaxerxes came into power. He ruled from 465 BC to 424 BC. And this is when Nehemiah takes place. The reconstruction of the Second Temple, once again, is slow moving. The walls of Jerusalem are still torn down. The whole nation is distraught. They're living in disgrace. They're living in danger. And then Nehemiah, this cupbearer, this glorified butler who hears about the difficulty of his people, has this Popeye moment. Do you guys remember Popeye? You know, good old Popeye, right? His forearms were bigger than his thighs. And Popeye's arch nemesis was Brutus. I mean, Popeye and Brutus would always be bumping heads, and then all of a sudden, Popeye would have that moment where he would say, "That's all I can stand, 'cause I can't stand no more." And he eats his spinach, and he goes up and he whoops up on Brutus, saves the day. Well, that's kind of exactly what happened to Nehemiah. Nehemiah had one of these Popeye moments where he says, "That's all I can stand, 'cause I can't stand no more." In other words, somebody has got to do something about this. It might as well be me. It's almost like Nehemiah drew a line in the sand and said, it is time to act. Somebody has got to do something about this. It might as well be me. My friends, and God used Nehemiah, an ordinary Joe Schmo, a cupbearer, a glorified butler, to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. He did it in 52 days, what should have taken years. He was able to organize and construct in 52 days. See, God uses ordinary people just like you and I to be world changers. God uses ordinary world changers. And I think from Nehemiah, we can see three different principles. God uses people who sit down and cry. Nehemiah chapter 1 said, "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." He sat down and he cried. Reminds me of Jesus in Luke chapter 19, verse 41. When Jesus was coming over the Mount of Olives, he was entering into the holy city in that final week of his life. He looks over the city and he just stops and he weeps because they reject what would bring them ultimate peace. They're rejecting him. You know, on the side of the Mount of Olives right now, there's a chapel called Dominus Flevit. It's Latin for the Lord wept. It's a traditional site where Jesus stopped and he wept over his people. He wept over the city of Jerusalem. It also reminds me of Matthew chapter 9. The scripture says, when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. The New Testament was written in Greek, and the Greek word for compassion, it's kind of a fun word to say. It's splagnizomai. And splagnizomai is this like inward, most inner being kind of compulsion. It's like his bowels are hurting. He's moved so deeply. And every time Jesus has compassion, he's compelled to act. Every time he's inwardly moved like that, he does something about it. Well, Nehemiah, he sits down to cry. And I can just picture it because for some days he sat down and wept. I mean, this is one of those ugly kind of cries. You know what I'm talking about, ladies? When you're crying, your makeup gets all messed up, or guys, you're so upset that you can't think about anything else. You just kind of fall down to your knees. That's exactly what's happening to Nehemiah. He sits down and he begins to weep. He can't stand up. Now, what's amazing is Nehemiah is in the citadel of Susa, modern day Iran. Jerusalem is over 1,000 miles away. It would take months for him to travel there. Nehemiah had never visited Jerusalem. He was probably born and raised in captivity. And in all honesty, Nehemiah, he was living the good life. I mean, yeah, he was a glorified butler, but he would have been living in the palace. He would have been eating well. He would have been, well dressed. He would have been protected. I mean, Nehemiah kind of had it going on. He was living the good life, much like us. I mean, we don't worry about what we're going to eat today. Most of us, we don't worry about what pair of shoes we're going to put on in the morning. We are so blessed in so many ways. And have you ever noticed it's easier to duck the pain? You know what I'm talking about? You read a newspaper article or you see a news broadcast, and maybe it's like something about kids who are starving because they're hungry. And you think to yourself, wow, that's horrible. These kids are so hungry. I'm hungry too. And we go to the refrigerator and get something to eat. And at times we'll write a check to kind of appease our guilt. Or we might say to somebody, you know what, I'll pray for you. And then we do nothing about it. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, prayer is powerful, but then we do absolutely nothing about it. You see, Nehemiah, he hears about the plight of his people in Jerusalem. And he says, this isn't okay. Somebody has got to do something about this. It might as well be me. My friends, let me challenge you. What is it that breaks your heart? I mean, what breaks your heart? What is it that gets you stirring, that hits you deep inside? I mean, what is it that breaks God's heart? I love that old saying, break my heart for what breaks yours. What is it that breaks your heart? Maybe it's the abuse that you see out there or hear about. Maybe it's human trafficking or the violence that just seems to be running so rampant in our culture. Or maybe it's hunger and you really feel this burden for people who don't have enough food, who can't feed their children. Or maybe it's illness and people who struggle with cancer. Or maybe your heart breaks for marriages, relationships that are struggling. Because you know so many people whose relationships just seem to be falling apart. Or maybe your heart breaks for those who just don't know Jesus and they're lost. I mean, what breaks your heart? And maybe you're even thinking to yourself, why doesn't anyone care? Why doesn't anyone do anything about this? Why doesn't anyone care about this as much as I care about this? My friends, that's because God chose you. You did not choose your burden. Your burden chose you. And I've heard it said, let your misery become your ministry. Oh, that's good. Let your misery become your ministry. What is it that breaks your heart? What is it that compels you to say, somebody has got to do something about this? It might as well be me. You see, God uses ordinary world changers who sit down and cry. Secondly, he uses world changers who kneel down to pray. Again, Nehemiah writes, for some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. My friends, when life gives you more than you can stand, kneel down and pray. I maintain some of the most important time you will spend on earth is time in prayer. I've also heard it said that God plus one always is a majority. God plus one is always a majority. Over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to prove to you that God is raising up leaders, that God is raising you up to be a leader. And you might be saying, yeah, I'm only a housewife. No, you are a spiritual leader. No, I cut hair for a living. No, God is using you. God is calling you to be a spiritual leader. No, I mow lawns for a living. No. You are a secret agent. You are a spiritual leader that God is going to use to accomplish his purposes. And in week 3, I'm going to show you how we as spiritual leaders have to push through the opposition. Whenever you get off the fence, whenever you're going to use your gifts, your talents, your abilities to build something up, there is always going to be people or things or situations that are going to oppose you. They're going to try to stand in the way of you accomplishing it. But a good leader pushes through the opposition. And in week 4, we're going to talk about all the distractions out there that try to take our focus away from that which needs to be accomplished. There's so much out there vying for our attention, vying for our energy. But a good leader is laser focused. And my friends, when you can stay laser focused, you can accomplish anything. And good leaders, Nehemiah, they were bathed in prayer. The last, 7 verses of Nehemiah is a prayer. He's praying to God, confessing his sins, confessing the sins of his nation, asking God for guidance. See, the best leaders pray. And in the book of Nehemiah, there are actually 14 recorded prayers. So what breaks your heart? What breaks your heart? My friends, start praying. Start praying about it. You know, research tells us that only 38% of people who profess to be Christian pray. 1/3 of us. Start praying. And as Nehemiah prayed, God directed him and guided him, and he built the walls in 52 days. Once again, what should have taken years, he was able to accomplish in a couple of months. God uses ordinary world changers. Thirdly, the third principle, God uses world changers who stand up to act. You see, after a significant time in prayer, actually it was several months, Nehemiah finds himself in the presence of King Artaxerxes. We're not sure where he was for the last couple of months. He may have been traveling. He may not have been in the palace. But several months later, there is Nehemiah in the presence of King Artaxerxes. And the king looks at him and says, Nehemiah, you look sad. Now, the backstory of this is in Nehemiah chapter 2. Nehemiah says, I was very much afraid. Well deserved. Because you see, when you are in the presence of the king, you are always supposed to look happy. You were never supposed to look downcast, because if the king was having a bad day, he could have just simply said, off with his head, be gone with him. And so the king recognized that Nehemiah was downcast. And then all of a sudden he says, Nehemiah, what's wrong? Well, Nehemiah butters him up. I mean, this is a spiritual principle here. He laid it on thick. Nehemiah said, may the king live forever. And there it is. In other words, king, you're looking good. King, did you get a new haircut? King, did you lose weight? You're looking swell in that new robe of yours. He said, may the king live forever. And then he went in for the ask. He said, why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been burned and destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it that you want? Nehemiah said, then I prayed. My friends, this was a flare prayer. There was no time to go into his room and close the door and get on his knees. There was no time to go away to some place in solitude. I mean, he was on the move. He was on the run. It was a flare prayer. Then he said, I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it. Did you get that? Send me so I can rebuild it. Nehemiah doesn't just mope and whine and complain and then do nothing about it. He said, send me so that I can rebuild it. In other words, somebody has got to do something about this. It might as well be me. His misery became his ministry. Nehemiah knew that God plus one is always a majority. My friends, God has proven his power. God has proven his love for you. As the one who created the heavens and the earth humbled himself, took on human form, lived a perfect life, God allowed himself to be sacrificed, to pay the debt, the penalty that we could not pay. And he rose again on the third day. That's power. He rose from the dead on the third day and lives. He has proven his love for you, and God has given you his power. You have God's Spirit, not a portion of his Spirit, but you have a full measure of God's Spirit. The same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, the same Spirit that transformed the disciples from hiding behind locked doors to boldly proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. The same Spirit that was in them is in you. God has given you his power. God has given you his word. As St. Paul writes in Romans chapter 1, the gospel is the power of God for the salvation of all who believe. That Greek word for power is dunamis. It's dynamite. It's this explosive power. And God promises, Jesus promises, I will be with you always till the very end of the age. Now, I know some of you out there are thinking, but I'm only one person. We're only one family. How much could we possibly accomplish? Well, the truth is, you can't do everything. But my friends, you can do something. You can do something. I had an elementary school student once raise over $5,000 to feed chronically hungry children. An elementary school girl was able to raise over $5,000 because she was passionate about something. Or maybe your passion is for countries who don't know Jesus. This is a church in Cuba. Now, ever since the revolution in Cuba, you cannot build new churches. So what do? They build a house. That's the pastor's house. And out of his house, he ministers to an entire community. And my friends, the church in Cuba is alive and well. This is a picture of the children in Cuba. I mean, they hear the gospel every week as that pastor ministers to his community. Or maybe your heart is for theological education of pastors in India, where once again, Christianity is exploding. Or maybe your heart goes to Redeeming Life Ministries just outside of Orlando. It's a ministry that serves single moms in crisis and their children. And this is Cameron, who was born just this last week. Or maybe your heart goes out to people who suffer from human trafficking. And you're thinking to yourself, yeah, once again, I can't save everybody, but you know what? You can save one. And when you do that, it's important to that one. Do you remember this guy? His name is Todd Beamer. This last week, we remembered 9/11, 23 years ago. Todd Beamer was on United Air Flight 93. The terrorists had already taken control of the plane. Todd and a group of individuals were in the back of the plane. There was one terrorist watching them with a box cutter. The other two terrorists had already entered the cockpit and had taken control of the plane. Todd was able to use his cell phone to dial out, and he got hold of Lisa. Lisa was a telephone supervisor with GTE. He was able to talk with Lisa and tell him the situation. Lisa brought on a supervisor from the FBI, and they talked with Todd. They didn't pull any punches. They told him exactly what was happening. At this point, the Twin Towers were already gone. The Pentagon had already been hit. Thousands of people had already lost their life. The plane had turned around and was heading back towards Washington, D.C. The FBI said to Todd, you've got about 20 minutes before you're in Washington. Todd, talking to Lisa, said, make sure you tell my wife and my children. He had 2 young children with a third on the way. Tell them how much I love them. And Lisa promised him that she would. And then he asked Lisa, would you pray with me? And she said yes. They prayed the Lord's Prayer. They recited Psalm 23. And then Todd, he said, Lord, help me. Jesus, help me. And then those famous words, let's roll. Somebody has got to do something about this. It might as well be me. And how many lives did he save? We really don't know. But somebody has got to do something about this. It might as well be me. My friends, God has given you his love. God has given you his power. A church full of ordinary people who care with the power of the gospel. My friends, we are world changers. I can't help think what broke the heart of Jesus was the fact that we were lost. It was his greatest burden, and he gave his all for you. What breaks your heart? What is it that you're thinking, somebody has got to do something about this? It might as well be me. My friends, we're not called to be spectators. We're called to leave it all on the field. What is your burden? What breaks your heart? What is calling you? Have a great day, and God bless.